Hello, everyone, and here I am with yet another podcast episode to kickstart the new year. And well, what a new year it has been already. In this episode, I have a special guest where we'll be talking about a very timely topic, which I'm sure will be of interest to many of you, and that is the language of Donald Trump. My name is Neda Salashur, and welcome to the Language and Society podcast. I think many of us were hoping that the new year could mark a fresh start, a new beginning, where all our worries and problems would magically disappear, or at least put behind us. But maybe that was a little unrealistic, as we know that calendar dates have very little connection to actually what happens in the real world. And given what has already unfolded, from the new variants of the virus, to the attack on the Capitol building in the United States, to January 1st marking Britain's first day outside of EU, it's fair to say that it will be yet another interesting year and that we should be expecting more and new challenges to come. Now, I think most of us would agree that American politics is a very relevant topic for us to be discussing at the moment, as it has implications for all of us. And I literally mean all of us, as what happens in the States has implications both for the United States allies around the world, as well as countries in the Middle East and beyond. And so to help me break down some important socio-political topics, I'll be inviting guests onto the show throughout the year to share their thoughts and their comments. And today's guest is Professor Norma Mendoza Denton, who's a professor in linguistic anthropology with the University of California. Good afternoon, Professor Mendoza Denton, and thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today and to discuss what is a very topical and controversial issue, namely that of the language of Donald Trump. A very unique language style which has won the hearts of many and left others in pure disgust. We will be discussing some key topics from your recently published book called Language in the Trump Era, Scandals and Emergencies. And I should explain that one of the purposes behind this podcast series is to explore the various branches of applied language studies. And as we have a very wide audience who listen to these podcast episodes, from academics and linguists to members of the public who are interested in socio-political issues and their relationship with language, we really want to use this session together to unpack some questions relating to Trump's unique use of language. But before we explore that, what I think might be useful is if you could talk a bit about the field of linguistic anthropology, as I'm sure that there will be some among the audience who wouldn't have heard about this particular field before. So what exactly is linguistic anthropology all about?
First of all, thank you for having me, Neda. I really appreciate the invitation to speak to your audience. And I'm just going to say my original training for my PhD was in sociolinguistics. And I'm now in a linguistic anthropology department. And I think that part of the reason for that is because anthropology has a specific method that it sort of practices, or at least the cultural and linguistic parts of anthropology are very committed to ethnographic work. And ethnographic work keeps being something that I come back to continually. So even though I may have, a period of time where I look at the media or I look at public speeches or texts or whatever, I always do come back to trying to ground it in anthropological ethnographic understanding. So in some ways, there's many ways in which applied linguistics broadly writ is not very different from linguistic anthropology. We mostly are interested in many of the same speech phenomena with many similar methods. But at least within the United States, where linguistic anthropology, I think, is most common, we do have a commitment to just that particular theoretical baggage that comes from, establishing this field, and also to the ethnographic method, like I said. So just being embedded in the situation with the people that you work with.
So based on what you said, it seems that linguistic anthropology has a strong focus on ethnographic methods, where the researcher embeds themselves within the context and the situations they are researching. Are there any other differences between linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics?
Some areas of sociolinguistics are much more quantitative, even though they're still going to maybe go out and, do some field work. The results would be written up in a quantitative, statistical way, which is not really so common in linguistic anthropology. So sometimes people do, but mostly linguistic anthropology would be more qualitatively based.
Thanks for that clarification. Now, in your book, you talk about how one of the reasons why Trump leaves many people surprised is because or even shocked, shall I say, is because his speech style deviates from presidential speech qualities that we are normally used to. But what exactly are some typical presidential speech qualities that Trump's discourse deviates from?
Okay, well, certainly in the US, the discourse of past presidents would be sort of, I guess, the mold against which we are measuring the speech of Donald Trump. And the speech of Donald Trump deviates from that of other presidents along many different along many different axes. But I think one of the most striking ones is that he does this thing where he mocks people. So he will take up mention of an individual and start to mock them. And that hasn't really been seen, at least in the past 4 presidents that I have been looking at. So you don't really find that in Barack Obama, except for, of course, some parts where he actually was mocking Trump. He roasted him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner one year. So this type of mocking and name calling and what Hall, Goldstein, and Ingram within the book, their chapter in the book, are going to be calling a type of gestural quotation, right? Where a gesture is going to stand in for an individual, right? So for instance, when Trump would talk about Hillary Clinton, he not only called her crooked Hillary, but he would actually do some things with his body that were meant to convey that she was unstable, right? So, at one point she lost her footing coming out of a car, and he incorporated this into a routine that was all about her. Similarly, when he talked about Slow Joe or Sleepy Joe, that had a kind of embodied gestural expression as well. So sometimes he didn't even need to bring up the people, but would do these embodied gestures, and they served, in fact, as a kind of summary or a quote of what he thought about the individual in question. So this type of mocking, or what some people really found struck them as a kind of schoolyard bully type of stance, I think that is really unprecedented. Yeah. So that part of his speech, I think, strikes people as not particularly precedential.
And so on the topic of Trump's discourse, in the book you mentioned that problems with verbal form, such as repeated spelling mistakes that we commonly see in Trump's tweets, can reflect specific deficits such as dyslexia. And in other sections you refer to claims about Trump having dementia. And later on, you refer to Professor Alan Bell's theory of audience design and how Trump may be accommodating his language to suit his audience. In your opinion, and given your analysis of his speech, is Trump dyslexic, Or do you think he's deliberately adjusting his language style to appeal to his key audience, which according to polls are white working class Americans? In other words, I suppose what I'm asking is Trump smarter than he actually is portraying himself to be?
Okay, well, so the evidence is going to lie for us in terms of trying to locate patterns in his speech. So what level of grammar and vocabulary is Trump using? And definitely where Obama's speech was more or less at a 9th grade level, Trump's speech is at about a 4th grade level. Trump's speech has shorter sentences. Trump's speech has fewer complex clauses. All of those things that in linguistics we know signal complexity of thought are lacking in the public speeches of Donald Trump. Now, if you go back in time, this is not the case in interviews that that Trump had reported. So when he was a younger man and he was involved in the New York real estate world, he was interviewed a lot, and he was interviewed because he was coming up and he had a lot of things to say, and a lot of them were said with words that were essentially lower frequency. So when you have a lower frequency word, it signals something about the possibility of maybe as you get older, losing access to that layer of the lexicon. But that's the trick, right? Like, has he lost access to these less frequent words, or is he merely trying to, in a sense, style shift, right? So I used to think that maybe his lack of complexity in his speech signaled neurocognitive deficits, but now I'm more of the opinion that it's calculated.
I find it so interesting that you just mentioned that you've noticed quite a difference in the level of the linguistic sophistication of Trump's discourse when you compare his discourse from when he was young with his current discourse. Because I remember some months back, I watched a Netflix series called Trump and an American Dream. And if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend it that you do. And in that documentary, there were clips of interviews with Trump from when he was a young entrepreneur. And as I watched those interviews, that's precisely what I also pointed out to my partner too, namely that he was using a much better range of vocabulary and grammatical structures in his discourse compared to now. So it's really interesting that you also have noticed that. And actually that kind of takes me to my next question, which is, if other linguists wanted to access Trump's discourse to conduct analysis on, which database could they get it from?
A lot of the work that I've done has come from a database. So I'm doing some corpus linguistics here called factbase.se, factba.se. And that's a fact base, and it archives all the speech of Donald Trump. So 7 million plus words of Trump's speeches, tweets, policy, and his old vlog.
And just following on from that, we know that the majority of Trump supporters are predominantly white and without a university degree. But something that intrigues me, considering Trump's racist policies and ideologies, is why does he also have supporters from the POC or from the BIPOC community? And I might just take a moment to explain what POC and BIPOC stand for those who may not have heard them before. But they're basically, POC stands for people of color, and BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And BIPOC has gained more popularity since the Black Lives Matter movement, which many people would think, started in 2020 because that's when it gained media attention. But in reality, it started way back in 2013. But coming back to my question is, what interest of this very large and diverse non-white community does Trump actually serve, and why does he have support from some members of them?
Within the Latinx community, within the African American community, within the Indigenous community, there are so many different reasons why people would vote for Trump, right? And so I think that part of the issue for Latinx people might be, that he plays a kind of go-getter masculinity that may appeal to some men, right? He plays upon the religious issues that may appeal to some religious people. He plays upon economic issues that may appeal to some people who believe that he would be on the right track with the economy, right? That's consistently what got him the highest ratings. And then he also, a student once asked me whether Latinx people were more susceptible to Trump's speech because we are more used to having essentially dictators like, these masculine heads of state that are really abusive. And that I hadn't thought of it that way, but that might be a possibility, right? That people in Latin America, we're much more familiar with this idea of a strong man. So that might be a kind of return of the repressed in a way.
Now, in your book, you expand on the topic of political correctness, or what is commonly abbreviated to being PC. For those who may not have heard this term before, political correctness is used to describe language policies or measures that are intended to avoid offence or disadvantage to members of particular groups in society. So, for example, rather than saying Merry Christmas during the months of December, PC supporters would use a more inclusive term such as Happy Holidays or Season's Greeting, which shows that you acknowledge that not everyone will be celebrating Christmas at that time of the year. Or another example is, while in the past it was okay to ask someone if they were married or if they had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, now some prefer to say, do you have a partner? As the term partner is a gender-neutral way to phrase it and avoids assuming that a person has to be in a heterosexual relationship or that they have to be married at all. So, linking this to what you talk about in your book, where you say that Trump and his right-wing supporters are generally against being politically correct, and you go on to elaborate and give multiple reasons as to why this could be. One of the reasons is because Trump supporters refuse to accept that word choice creates a problem at all, that it doesn't matter what kind of language we use. Another reason that you mention is that his supporters hate being politically correct because they believe it limits freedom of speech. And I think the third thing that you mention is that it seems that being politically correct or using politically correct language is more characteristic of a certain class of people, namely those who are highly educated, those who are elite. And so those who are not really part of the highly educated elite group, they prefer not to use the language associated with the elite. So it's fair to say that there's some form of a language war going on here between the politically left and the political right, where the politically left support the use of PC language, whereas the political right generally don't. But what I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, which do you support? I mean, should we be using politically correct language?
As for me personally, I believe that people should be called whatever they wish to be called, and not what you want them to be called. So, for instance, you may know this word Latinx. It's spelled Latinx, right? And that stands for Latina or Latino, or you just don't have to choose whether it's an A or an O. Right. Now, Latinx has come under tremendous pressure because people don't like it. They think it looks ugly with the X at the back. They think it's unpronounceable, even though, you can say Latinx. And they think that it's impossible to not choose an A or an O, Latina versus Latino. And so, of course, part of the loading of this word is that it started in academic and activist circles, and it's used very commonly in universities. But a lot of other people think it sounds elitist, they think it sounds weird. And for those of us who do use it, we want to acknowledge that the spectrum of gender in Spanish, Latina, Latino, is bifurcated between male and female, and that there are people who are not wanting to identify at any given moment as male or female. And so you use this form X instead. Now, a lot of people have criticized the use of Latinx, and that's one of the, I guess one of the forms that would be criticized for being politically correct. But when you are a trans person, a transgender person who doesn't feel included in Latina or Latino, for somebody else to hail you by Latinx, it's actually very validating, right? Because it means that you're not trying to force them into one or the other gender category. So that's just a small example.
And so that leads me to my last question, which is, in your book, you mentioned that the situation with Trump is symptomatic of a growing divide, a divide between the educated elite and the layman or the working class. And I'm actually going to go one step further and say that there's actually that I've noticed at least a strong and increasing anti-science or anti-intellectual movement or discourse gaining power in societies around the world. And so my question is, what is it that we academics and intellectuals can do to bridge this gap and to ensure that people understand that the academic and scientific community are actually on their side and are working to better the societies we live in collectively? And what more can we do? What is it that we're not doing enough of?
So I think for academics, one of our deepest responsibilities is going to lie in being able to give back to the communities that are educating us and housing us and hosting us. And I feel very strongly that we need to be able to write so that people will read what we want to say. That we need to be able to write in a way that's accessible to everyday people, that you're not just writing for the 4 people that are in your specialty area. I mean, there's a place for that. It's called a dissertation, or school papers. But I think in general, if you're trying to reach out to people, it behooves us to be able to write more, to put ourselves out in the press more, to do podcasts such as this one, to start podcasts like you have. I think that's incredibly impressive, and it's just what we need to try to get our message out. But also, I think that being able to incorporate the opinions of people into that's why I'm an anthropologist, right? Is because I like to talk to people and to get their take on the world events that they're going through, on the economic crises that they're having, on how they see their own neighborhood and how they understand people from other parts. So I think that outreach is just critical, or else we're going to be, dinosaurs pretty soon as well.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Mendoza Denton.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that Q&A. Now, don't forget, if you did enjoy that, feel free to share it with members from your social circles. And of course, if you'd like to receive notification on future episodes, then do press that follow and get notification button. Till next time, I wish you health and safety. Take care.